11 months before the 2023 election, President Tinubu's campaign already had a slogan, "It is my turn." Today, barely 2 years into his administration, that same confidence is being quietly replaced by something else inside Aso Rock. Not arrogance, something more uncomfortable: anxiety. While the mainstream conversation is fixed on who will run against Tinubu in 2027, nobody is asking the more dangerous question: can Tinubu hold the conditions necessary for him to run at all? Because power in Nigeria has never simply been lost at the ballot box. It has always first been lost in the streets, in the markets, and in the silence of regions that stopped trusting a federal government entirely. And right now, three things are happening simultaneously that no Nigerian president has ever survived politically. Stay with me. Before we go further, if you're new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you're from, the political analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. To understand where we are going, you need to understand where we have been and how quickly the ground shifted. In late 2024, proxies close to the Tinubu administration began laying the groundwork for a 2027 re-election bid. This was not accidental. Loyalist candidates were being positioned for governorship races. Party structures within the APC were being quietly realigned. Signals were being sent to key power brokers in the Southwest, the Northwest, and the Federal Capital Territory. On the surface, it looked like the confident forward motion of an administration settling into power. Underneath, however, something else was happening. The administration's economic reform program, the removal of the fuel subsidy, the floating of the naira, and the unification of the exchange rate was producing measurable pain for ordinary Nigerians long before it was producing measurable gain. The price of petrol surged. The cost of food climbed to levels that ordinary households in Lagos, Kano, Enugu, and Port Harcourt had never experienced in their lifetimes. The naira, which had been artificially held at a fixed rate for years, was now finding its true market value, and that value was devastating to anyone whose income was denominated in it. By mid-2025, three separate crises that had been developing independently began to converge in a way that changed the political calculus entirely. Insecurity in the north was accelerating rather than retreating. Hyperinflationary pressure on urban households was not easing, and a poverty rate that the World Bank had projected would make Nigeria the global capital of extreme poverty was no longer a forecast. It was a lived daily reality for tens of millions of Nigerians. These three crises did not simply create governance problems. They began to intersect with political politics in ways that no amount of political messaging, no amount of infrastructure ribbon cutting, and no amount of presidential broadcast addresses could neutralize. Now, here is why this matters historically. Nigeria's political record shows clearly that incumbents who lose re-election rarely lose because of opposition strength alone. Consider what happened with President Buhari by 2022. His declining political grip was shaped less by PDP's competitiveness than by the collapse of his security credibility in the Northwest, his own political home, and by the economic disillusionment of a middle class that had shrunk dramatically under his watch. Tinubu faces a structurally similar convergence today. The difference is that it is arriving earlier and with higher initial expectations that have not been met. And here's something I want you to hold on to, because I will come back to it in the second half of this analysis. There is one specific region of Nigeria where Tinubu's political numbers are collapsing in a way that makes 2027 mathematically very difficult, and it is not the region you are probably thinking of right now. Hold that thought. Now, let us talk about the institutions, because in Nigerian politics, understanding which institutional structures are holding, which are under pressure, and which are quietly recalibrating is often more revealing than anything a politician says publicly. Start with INEC. The Independent Nigerian Electoral Commission deployed BVAS technology in 2023, and that deployment created new transparency standards that will be extremely difficult to walk back in 2027 without triggering a political crisis of a different kind. Any attempt to compromise the integrity of the results transmission process in 2027 will be visible in a way it was not in previous electoral cycles. The technology has raised the cost of electoral manipulation, and that matters for whoever is in power when the next election arrives. The judiciary presents a different set of complications. The Supreme Court's 2023 ruling upheld Tinubu's election on largely procedural grounds rather than through a full evidentiary resolution of the substantive allegations that were brought before it. That ruling settled the legal question. It did not settle the legitimacy question. And that unresolved legitimacy deficit, the sense in significant portions of the Nigerian public that the election was not fully adjudicated on its merits, will shape how any legal challenge in 2027 is received, both domestically and internationally. The National Assembly is currently under Tinubu's effective control through a combination of APC party loyalty and what political observers politely call cross-party inducements. But loyalty in Nigerian political legislative politics is not ideological, it is transactional. And transactional loyalty has a very specific characteristic. It holds when the patron looks strong and it evaporates when the patron looks vulnerable. The moment that political vulnerability begins to show at the presidential level, the NAS arithmetic becomes far less predictable.
Then there are the security agencies, the SSS, the DSS, and the military. These are institutions that any administration uses to manage political space. But there are also institutions that are staffed heavily from the north, and their institutional disposition toward a southern presidency operating under conditions of severe northern insecurity is not something that can simply be assumed or commanded. It is something that has to be continuously earned through policy performance. Now, here is what most political analysts get wrong about the institutional picture. The real institutional threat to Tinubu's 2027 bid is not INEC, it is not the courts, it is not even the formal opposition, it is the governors. As of this analysis, there are at least 4 APC governors whose public expressions of solidarity with Asorok are coexisting privately with serious conversations about what a post-Tinubu APC looks like. That is not speculation or partisanship. That is the pattern that has preceded every major intra-party rupture in Nigerian political history, and any serious student of this country's politics recognizes it immediately. Constitutionally, the picture is straightforward. Section 137 of the 1999 Constitution limits a sitting president to 2 terms. Tinubu is on his first. There is no term limit barrier. Nothing in the Constitution prevents a sitting president from seeking re-election even amid serious crises. But Nigeria's political economy creates informal mechanisms of exclusion that can be just as binding as any constitutional provision. And it is those informal mechanisms that are currently the more relevant threat. Let us now move into the strategic layer, because behind every public political position in Nigeria, there is a calculation, and those calculations are shifting. Who benefits from Tinubu's vulnerability? Begin with Peter Obi and the Labour Party. Their 2023 performance, particularly among urban youth and across the southeast, demonstrated something that changed Nigerian political thinking. There is a structural base in this country that does not depend on traditional patronage networks. A Tinubu administration weakened by economic failure plays directly into Labour's framing, because Labour's argument was never simply vote for Peter Obi. It was, the old political system has failed you. Every month that the economic pain continues, that argument becomes stronger. Then there is Atiku Abubakar and the PDP. Despite multiple failed presidential attempts, Atiku commands a northern political infrastructure that becomes enormously valuable in a fragmented 2027 field. His key calculation is whether to use that infrastructure to consolidate the northern vote around a single candidate, or whether it serves him better politically to fracture it and force a second-round scenario. That calculation will not be made in public. Inside the APC itself, there are significant dissidents who were never fully absorbed into the Tinubu coalition. Names like Rotimi Amechi and Kayode Fayemi represent a wing of the party, nominally progressive, substantively ambivalent about Abuja's current direction, whose moment arrives if and when presidential approval numbers continue to decline. They have not moved, they are watching, and in Nigerian politics, those who watch patiently are often the ones who move decisively. Now, here is a number that reframes everything. In the 2023 election, approximately 9.5 million valid votes were cast. Tinubu won with 8.8 million of them. Let that settle for a moment. His winning margin was not a mandate drawn from a mobilized national coalition. It was a plurality in a three-way fragmented field where his opponents split the remaining vote. The 2027 question, therefore, is not whether a united opposition can beat him. It is whether the exact fragmentation that benefited him in 2023 can be reconstructed 2 years from now. And the answer to that question is being written right now, in food prices, in security reports, and in the private conversations of governors and party chairmen across 36 states. Who stands to lose the most from a Tinubu political collapse? The Southwest political establishment carries the heaviest exposure. The Afenifere-aligned networks, the Lagos business community, the broader Yoruba political architecture, all of it has tied its national credibility to this presidency in ways that are not easily reversed. A failed Tinubu presidency does not simply end one man's career, it potentially ends the Southwest's claim to presidential rotation for a generation. That is an enormous political stake, and it shapes the behavior of every significant actor in that region. Northern governors who endorsed Tinubu over a northern candidate in 2023 are also deeply exposed. They made a calculation that proximity to power would protect their state's interests better than ethnic solidarity. That calculation is now being tested against the reality of worsening insecurity and an economic situation that their constituents are experiencing as abandonment rather than reform. The Middle Belt deserves particular attention here because it is a swing region that analysts consistently underweight. The Middle Belt is currently experiencing some of the most acute food insecurity in the country, driven by the intersection of farmer-herder conflict that has never been structurally resolved, farmer displacement, and a collapse of agricultural livelihoods that has been building for years. How this region votes in 2027 could be decisive, and right now, the signals coming out of it are not favorable to the administration. There are also stakeholders in this equation who never appear on political panels, but whose behavior matters enormously. International creditors and the IMF have given Tinubu political cover for his difficult economic reforms. The narrative that difficult but necessary restructuring is underway has served the administration diplomatically. But that cover is conditioned on visible progress towards stability. It is not unconditional. And the Nigerian business elite, whose public statements about supporting the administration diverge sharply from their private conversations about political risk, are running their own calculations about when to hold and when to move.
Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Step back from the electoral mechanics for a moment, because what we are really talking about is the condition of a nation and what happens to political leadership when that condition deteriorates below a certain threshold. The current administration's approach to economic management has been heavily centralized, particularly through the CBN and NNPCL. That centralization has sharpened tensions with state governments that are struggling to fund the basic services their citizens expect. States like Borno, Zamfara, and Kogi are managing genuine security emergencies with federal allocations that are structurally insufficient to address them. The failure of fiscal federalism in Nigeria is not a new problem, but under the current conditions, it is generating political grievances at the state level that opposition actors are very actively exploiting. The economic picture for ordinary Nigerians requires honest language. Nigeria's food inflation rate crossed 40% at multiple points since the 2023 reforms began. That number represents the systematic destruction of purchasing power for urban working-class Nigerians, precisely the demographic that proved decisive in key states in the 2023 election. The administration's defense of its economic program, that reform pain is front-loaded while the gains are back-loaded, is analytically defensible. The political question it cannot answer is whether those gains will arrive before the 2027 ballot. That is not a rhetorical question. It is the central variable in this entire analysis. The poverty dimension is not an abstraction. When the World Bank identifies Nigeria as home to more people living in extreme poverty than any other country on earth, that is not a development statistic to be managed in a press release. It is a political time bomb. And the crucial point, the one that political operatives often miss, is that hunger does not produce political apathy. It produces political volatility. People who are hungry and exhausted do not stay home on election day. They vote, and they vote for change. The interethnic and interfaith dimension of this crisis is also being carefully monitored. The perception, managed but never fully suppressed, that this is a Southwest Yoruba presidency has implications for national cohesion that go beyond electoral politics. The administration's response to insecurity in predominantly Muslim northern states and its approach to the IPOB situation in the southeast are being evaluated simultaneously through ethnic and religious lenses. In a country as diverse as Nigeria, any presidency that is perceived as ethnically partial, whether that perception is fair or not, faces a structural headwind that compounds every other challenge it carries. The security picture, stated plainly, is the administration's most exposed political flank. Banditry in the northwest has displaced millions of Nigerians and collapsed agricultural production across a region that was once the country's food basket. Terrorism in the northeast has not been defeated despite years of sustained military operations. Kidnapping, once a regional phenomenon associated with the South-South's oil politics, has become a national experience. A president who cannot demonstrate credible, measurable security improvement in his first term will carry that failure as his defining political liability into 2027. The international dimension of this story is often dismissed as peripheral to Nigerian domestic politics. It should not be. The United States and the United Kingdom have observed Nigeria's democratic consolidation with a combination of genuine investment and strategic interest. Nigeria is too large, too economically significant, and too regionally influential for Western governments to treat its electoral processes with indifference. The BVAS transmission anomalies that were documented during the 2023 election were noted in Western diplomatic reporting. The key phrase in that sentence is noted. It means they are on record, and a repeat pattern in 2027 would be interpreted against that record. A 2027 election perceived internationally as manipulated would produce a very different diplomatic and economic response than anything Nigeria has experienced in previous electoral cycles. The IMF and World Bank dimension is double-edged. Tinubu has secured genuine international credibility as a reform-oriented president. The subsidy removal and Naira reforms were received positively by multilateral institutions that had been advocating for exactly those corrections. But that credibility is conditioned on outcomes, not just on the policy intent. If the poverty and inflation trajectories do not show improvement, international institutional support shifts from being a domestic political asset to a domestic political liability, because it becomes possible for the opposition to argue that the administration is managing Nigeria's economy for Washington and London, not for the market woman in Kano. Nigeria's ECOWAS leadership role deserves mention. Already strained by the military coups in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, and by the diplomatic humiliation of an ECOWAS intervention threat that was never backed by credible military action, Nigeria's regional authority is under pressure. A domestically weakened Nigerian presidency has reduced capacity to project regional authority, which in turn reduces Nigeria's leverage with China, the Gulf states, and the multilateral institutions where African diplomatic weight is negotiated. For Nigerians in the diaspora, in the UK, the US, Canada, and across Europe, the picture is this. The economic conditions driving the Japa phenomenon have not slowed under this administration. By most measures, they have accelerated. The Japa wave is not merely a social observation about young Nigerians seeking better lives. It is a political signal of the first order. When a country's most economically productive citizens are voting with their feet at scale, the domestic political consequences accumulate in remittance flows, in political disengagement, and eventually in the organization of diaspora voices that are increasingly vocal, increasingly connected, and increasingly unwilling to stay silent about governance failures at home. A 2027 election that requires international observer credibility will have to contend with a diaspora that is watching more closely than any previous generation.
And now, I promised you I would return to something. Earlier in this analysis, I told you there is one region of Nigeria where Tinubu's numbers are collapsing in a way that makes 2027 mathematically very difficult, and I told you it is not the region you expect. Here is the answer. It is the South-South. The oil-producing states, historically the engine of PDP dominance and the region whose federal revenue dependency makes it acutely sensitive to the terms of resource allocation, are showing deep dissatisfaction with how federal revenue sharing has operated under this administration. Governors who publicly aligned with Tinubu in 2023 are quietly recalibrating their positions, and without a credible showing in the South-South, the electoral mathematics of 2027 simply do not work. That is not analysis. That is arithmetic. Any honest analysis has to engage seriously with the strongest arguments on the other side, and there are serious arguments. The first is incumbency advantage. In Nigerian elections, the incumbent administration's control of state resources, security apparatus, and patronage networks has historically been decisive. That is true. It is not propaganda, it is the record. But incumbency advantage is not a fixed quantity. It depends on the state's capacity to distribute resources meaningfully. When inflation erodes the real value of political patronage, when the money that used to buy political loyalty buys less food, less fuel, less peace, the machinery of incumbency weakens. The advantage remains, but it is not inexhaustible. The second argument is that the opposition is too divided to defeat Tinubu. This is currently accurate and cannot be dismissed. A repeat of the 2023 three-way split in which the opposition's combined vote far exceeded Tinubu's but was distributed across two losing candidates would almost certainly return Tinubu to power. The counterpoint is that political realignment in Nigeria moves with a speed that surprises outside observers every single time. The PDP-Labour alignment conversation that seemed theoretical in early 2024 had become substantively concrete by mid-2025. Opposition unity is not guaranteed, but neither is opposition fragmentation, and anyone who treats it as a permanent condition is misreading how quickly Nigerian political architecture can shift. The third argument is the administration's own central case. Economic pain is short-term, reforms take time, and the gains will arrive. This is analytically defensible, and it deserves to be treated seriously rather than dismissed. The subsidy removal and Naira unification were corrections that economists across the political spectrum had advocated for decades. The question is not whether those reforms were right in principle. The question is whether ordinary Nigerians can absorb the full weight of the transition cost before the political cost to the administration becomes irreversible. That is a race between economic recovery and electoral timing, and nobody, including the administration, knows with certainty who wins that race. Here is the framing that almost everyone gets wrong, and this matters. The 2027 election will not ultimately be decided by politicians, by party strategists, or by APC governors calculating their next move. It will be decided by a market woman in Kano who cannot afford tomatoes for her evening meal. It will be decided by a motorcyclist in Benin City whose fuel costs have tripled since he last voted. It will be decided by a graduate in Owerri who has been waiting 3 years for a government job that has not materialized and who is now asking a different question. Not which party to vote for, but whether the act of voting changes anything at all. These are not political actors in any formal sense, but their collective exhaustion is the most powerful political force in Nigeria today, and no campaign strategy has ever successfully engineered itself around it. The national interest frame, however, requires us to look past the electoral question entirely. The deeper question, the one that will matter long after 2027, is not whether Tinubu wins or loses. It is whether Nigeria's institutions can manage a genuinely competitive election and facilitate a genuine transfer of power if the electorate decides that is what it wants. That is the standard by which Nigeria's democratic health should be measured. Not by any single candidate's survival, but by the country's capacity to hold itself together through a contested political process and emerge with legitimate governance on the other side. What happens next, and what should you be watching for? On the administration side, expect a sharp escalation in visible federal intervention programs in the 12 to 18 months before the 2027 campaign season formally begins. Infrastructure announcements will increase, social safety net programs will be expanded or at minimum publicized more aggressively. Messaging will be deliberately recalibrated towards the Northwest and the South-South, the two regions where the political numbers are most under pressure. Watch also for cabinet reshuffles designed to broaden the ethnic and regional representation of the government's visible face, because perception management at this stage of a presidency is not cosmetic, it is strategic. On the opposition side, the critical variable remains whether Labour, PDP, and any APC defectors that emerge can agree on a unity candidate framework, or whether they repeat the fragmentation that gave Tinubu his first-term plurality. The early indicator, the one to watch before any formal 2027 positioning begins, is the 2026 gubernatorial elections. What states show political realignment and in which direction? Gubernatorial races in Nigeria are not simply local contests, they are the testing ground for presidential coalitions. The Northern Governors Forum's public stance is another early warning indicator. These governors have maintained formal solidarity with Abuja, but solidarity in Nigerian politics has a specific duration and a specific price. Private dissent historically becomes public political repositioning approximately 18 to 24 months before a general election. If that pattern holds, the first public breaks should become visible by late 2025 or late 2026.
There are also specific signals that will confirm that the political situation is escalating rather than stabilizing. If a sitting APC governor publicly breaks with the administration or endorses an opposition figure, not quietly but on the record, that is a significant escalation signal. If a formal opposition coalition announces a named presidential candidate before the fourth quarter of 2025, the 2027 race has begun in earnest, and the administration is already on the defensive. If there is a significant deterioration in the Naira exchange rate or any reversal of the subsidy reform under popular pressure, that signals policy instability that opposition actors will immediately exploit. The long-term governance stakes deserve an honest assessment. If Tinubu wins re-election in 2027 under conditions of continued economic difficulty and unresolved insecurity, if the election is not clean, if the institutions are seen to have bent, Nigeria faces a governance legitimacy crisis of a kind that will be very difficult to reverse in any medium-term horizon. Conversely, a credible electoral process that produces a clear, accepted result, whatever that result is, would represent something genuinely significant, evidence that Nigeria's democratic institutions have matured to the point where political power can change hands or be renewed through a process that the country as a whole can accept. And now I want to close the second thread I opened at the beginning of this analysis. I asked whether Tinubu can hold the conditions necessary to run in 2027. Here is the answer, stated plainly. The conditions are not being held. They are being actively contested. And the contest is not coming from politicians in press conferences. It is coming from the price of rice in Balogun market. It is coming from the sound of gunshots in states that should be at peace. It is coming from the quiet disappearance of a Nigerian middle class that once formed the social backbone of electoral engagement in this country. That is not a campaign slogan. That is a structural political crisis. And structural political crises do not resolve themselves on a schedule that is convenient for any administration. We opened this analysis with one question, not who will run in 2027, not who will win, but whether Tinubu can hold the conditions necessary to run at all, to arrive at the ballot with the structural advantages of incumbency intact and the political coalition that brought him to power still coherent. The evidence does not produce a clean verdict in either direction. What it does produce is this: a president whose structural advantages, incumbency, party control, financial networks, and international reform credibility are real, substantial, and should not be underestimated. And facing those advantages, a convergence of crises, accelerating insecurity, devastating inflation, historic poverty that are equally real, equally substantial, and that no administration in Nigerian history has successfully weathered without paying a severe political price. Which force proves stronger will not be decided in the corridors of Aso Rock. It will not be decided in opposition strategy meetings. It will be decided in the markets and the farms and the streets, and ultimately in the polling units of 36 states and a federal capital territory by Nigerians from every region, every faith, and every economic condition, making the only judgment that cannot be managed, manufactured, or negotiated away. Nigeria's future does not belong to Tinubu. It does not belong to any opposition candidate. It belongs to the people. And in 2027, the people will speak. The only question that remains is whether the institutions will be strong enough and honest enough to listen. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Naija Update 24/7. We never stop watching. Once again, kindly remember to subscribe to my channel. I understand it means nothing to you, but it means everything to me. This work of research and analysis cost me a lot, and the only means of paying me back is your subscription. Thank you.